Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of AAE board member and Director of Professional Development, Neil Otto, it's my pleasure to welcome you to another webinar hosted by the American Association for Employment and Education. Today's topic is Reimagine Hiring Intentional Interviewing for Pre-K through 12 Positions. My name is Tim Newbert and I serve as AAE's Executive Director. Please allow me to cover just a few housekeeping matters before we begin with today's topic. During the webinar, all attendees will be muted by default. However, today's settings will allow you to activate your video and, if desired, unmute your microphone to ask questions or share comments. You may also use the chat feature within Zoom. When using chat, you are encouraged to change the recipient default to all presenters and attendees, or I think it's everyone, to maximize participation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to attendees and AAE members. If your organization is not a current member of AAE, please visit our website, aaee.org, to learn more about our activities and resources. We are a professional association intent on positively impacting education through professional connections. Related to that mission, we connect the three critical groups involved with the preparation, recruitment, and retention of pre-K through 12 educators: university professionals and others who prepare educators, school system professionals and others who recruit, hire, and retain them, and of course, educator candidates themselves. We offer annual publications such as the Job Search Handbook for Educators. We conduct an educator supply and demand survey each fall and winter, resulting in a spring report. We host a pre-K through 12 job board and a calendar of education job fairs held around the country. We host webinars such as this one on topics relevant to our membership. We sponsor teacher scholarships and school system mini grants to support teacher pipelines. We host teacher job fairs, both in-person and virtual, and we host an annual conference and education career fair each fall. Our next event will be held in Louisville, Kentucky from October 26th through October 28th. How can you select the right candidates for your open roles? Applying a structured interview process to your candidate evaluation positions your school district to objectively measure the skills you need your teammates to have. A structured approach helps you protect against interviewer bias and helps you measure what matters from your candidates. We're joined today by Daniel Johnson and Baltavar Benavides from Education Elements to lead us in a best practices discussion of how to structure an interview process. They'll also have an interview question bank to share. Thanks for joining us today, Daniel and Baltazar. I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tim, AAE, and everyone who's with us today. We've got a good small-sized group here that will be perfect for this format. So again, thank you all for being here, and looking forward to jumping in as Tim set some of that context. We like to start every one of our sessions with an opportunity to just check in. It's also just helpful housekeeping for us. Gives us a sense of who's in the room and practices some of the engagement that we hope to create as we move through the session this afternoon. So if you could, in the chat, just share your name, the organization you're with, the role that you hold, and then our check-in questions is, what is something that you are particular or precise about? And I'll just kick us off. I was thinking about this every day, every morning. I start my day by cleaning out my email inbox. I'm very particular about not having any outstanding emails that aren't either starred or archived. And it's a habit. It's something I start my day and end my day with every day, and it kind of helps me just keep a clean house in order. So again, would love if you could share in the chat, maybe Baltazar, sorry, being a little informal here. Baltazar, if you would love to hear what is something you are particular precise about.
Thanks, Daniel. We can go with informal. We're a cozy group today, so feel free to call me Baltazar or Balto over the course of our hour together, everybody. I wish I had that habit, Daniel. As you explained that, I wish that was something that I was particular about. It's something I could do better about and would benefit from becoming more precise with. But I will share that the way I start my day is also precise, but in a different domain. I'm precise about my tea. I care a lot about the steeping time and temperature, depending on which leaves I'm drinking, and then if it's sweetened or if I have a snack to go with it. Particular about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Baltazar. And thank you for those of you who are chatting in right now. Scotty, eating consistently 3 meals a day. That's a great practice. Renee, keeping the email inbox tidy resonated. Love that. Tim, thank you. I am also a spelling and grammar, definitely on that same wavelength. Nice to meet you, Deborah. Thank you for being here. Wish I could do that. That is an awesome daily habit, being at the gym early in the morning. If it's Cami, thank you for being here today. Proper language, email and text. Dana, welcome as well. Setting up new phones exactly the same as old ones. Yes, understand that one. Hi, Chrissy. Thank you for being here as well. That's about pens I use at work. That's kind of a throwback these days. Thank you. Tracy, welcome as well. Also morning routine, kind of creating the structure and consistency that puts your day off to the right start. So thank you all for sharing. If you're still adding, we'd love to have you in the chat as well. Welcome, Dana. And we'll go ahead and get started here. We do call this, we are calling this a discussion series. We will have a few opportunities for discussion, and would love, if you're able, to come and follow some of the Zoom norms. You can keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, just in case there's any background noise going off. If you'd like to come on video, we would love to see you. It helps us read body language. It creates a little bit more of a close-knit environment, but also understand if you want to keep your video off as well. And please use the chat function to ask and answer questions at any point. We'll certainly keep that in front of us and go off any questions that get asked or commentary along the way. And welcome, Julie, as well. Lots of issues. Yeah, when I scanned this issue, I was like, man, I think I'm particular and precise about more things than I'm not. So I'm glad to hear got somebody else in the same boat here. I'll keep this really brief. We are, Baltazar and I are from a company called Education Elements. We are an education consultancy that has more than 10 years of experience. We've worked in more than 1,000 schools and districts. I think we're in more than 40 states. Most of our business comes from repeat clients. We have just generally very high satisfaction rates with the organizations that we partner with, and generally work with schools and districts on developing more responsive practices. We started really in the blended and personalized learning space, working with schools on how to transform their classrooms. And that has evolved over time into really a wide range of services, and part of which we'll be talking to you today about ways in which you can improve both your teacher recruitment and retention practices. So we'll share an opportunity, or we'll share some more resources as we go today. We encourage you to sign up for our blog or follow any of our collateral online as we go. But thank you all for being here this afternoon, and hope you walk away with a better sense of who we are and what we do. So thank you, Tim, for giving us the intros. We'll keep these really brief. My name is Daniel Johnson. I'm an associate partner with Ed Elements. I live and work out of Washington, D.C. Before joining this team, I worked in school systems in Mississippi and New York City, and I'm a Midwesterner. I grew up in Michigan and Louisville, Kentucky, so I see some Midwest representation here today. And I've been with Education Elements for about 7 years now, have worked with clients all over the country, but certainly focus on really East Coast clients as well. So I'll hand it over to Baltazar for an introduction as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Again, my name's Baltazar Benavides. Feel free to call me Balto. I have been a member of the Education Elements team for the last 3 years, working with school districts all over and how they approach instruction, strategic change, and also the way in which we approach teacher retention. Before coming to the EE team, was a teacher and coach, in Prince George's County outside DC, and then in Baltimore City. And born and raised in Houston, Texas, originally.
Thanks, Balto. So again, welcome. This is the second part of a three-part discussion series we're using to explore ways to redesign and reimagine your hiring process, from selecting the right candidates to interviewing and onboarding. On our first session, part one, we focused on developing really clear and coherent candidate profiles. And today we'll be connecting that with how you use those profiles to design interview processes that vet those profiles and provide feedback for more intentional onboarding. So we do intend each of these to stand alone, but also certainly encourage you to come back to our next session on August 26th, where we'll be really building off of today's content as well into how it can drive the onboarding and long-term retention of our teachers. So 3 objectives for our session today. First, we'll talk about the importance of structured hiring and the way we see that impact on teacher retention. We'll talk about best practices for designing more collaborative, intentional, and informative hiring processes that guide retention efforts. And we'll discuss a few use cases within and across your organization. So again, we certainly hope to hear from you all this afternoon on the ways in which this applies or resonates with your experience in your unique organizations or the work that you do. Wanted to share just a little bit of a zoom out on the way in which we think about recruitment and retention. And I know we have a variety of roles in the room and different ways in which you plug into this specific subject matter. We think about the educator experience along a series of stages, a life cycle. And our goal is to think about the ways in which we can improve that experience through building a sense of belonging and driving towards more fulfillment within each stage, which you see here on the right. And also as the way in which we transition those experiences from one stage to the next. So how does the recruitment phase really lead into an improved and more effective onboarding for your teachers? And so again, so what we'll be talking about today is really exists within and across the recruit and immerse stages of that work. 3 guiding questions for our series. How well does your interview process evaluate top competencies, develop connection and community, and ensure equitable access and assessment? How aligned are the different levels of your organization on that process? And how effectively does your year 1 onboarding align with candidate strengths and needs? So again, 3 guiding questions for this series. We'll really be looking at the second question of that today, but want to be connecting this to the larger perspective of this teacher experience across the different stages in that journey. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Baltazar to talk a little bit about structured hiring.
Thanks, Daniel. So in diving into the conversation around being intentional with our hiring, the first question that most folks run into is, what is our point of view around structured or unstructured interviews, right? Which of these formats is the right process with which to apply a filter to our candidates so we can get the right people in our positions? Those who fall on the unstructured interview side of this conversation would describe their process as not having a predetermined structure. An open flow exists with the interviewer being able to probe more deeply, follow up, and clarify certain understandings or perceptions from the candidate. Whereas a structured interviewer would explain, we have a systematic approach here where everyone's going to get the same questions, and all those questions are going to be listened to with a standardized scoring criteria right beside me so that I can evaluate these candidates across that standard rubric. And these are easier to replicate among my team. It's going to be easier to train people. And ultimately, it'll help me conduct more interviews faster. Our team has dove through lots of the research, and we stand firmly with the research that indicates that structured interviews are ultimately twice as effective as unstructured interviews are when it comes to predicting effective job performance. Some of the benefits, Daniel, if you don't mind going one slide further with me, some of the benefits here when we point to those structured interviews are the greater objectivity that's brought to the process, being able to tie all of the questions that are going to be asked to your candidates specifically to job-related questions, friendlier to equal opportunity, since all candidates will have access to all the same questions and thus criteria for evaluation. They work better in team hiring environments and helps us to weed out some of the bias that we'll naturally bring to the process. And significant of note is that organizations that use structured interviews have greater legal protection if and when that time ever is to come. So those are some of the reasons behind it. And along with that, we want to point to some of the research that our team has drawn from as we've oriented our approach to creating the right questions aligned to the right competencies. This study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, this looked at the hiring system within DC public schools for 2 years. And it's a big paper, lots of research in there. I know that's a text heavy slide. I want to point to a couple key insights from there. The first being that improving your selection process among your existing applicants may be even more cost effective than removing the teachers who perform poorly because of the substantial costs that it avoids. First and foremost, exposing your students to ineffective teachers. And secondly, compensating teachers for the increased risk of job separation. The second thing that is really significant within this research is that while there are very many screening measures that strongly predict teacher effectiveness, rarely are those screening measures associated with the likelihood of being hired, which means even though we might have the tools out there that can help us put the right people in our seats, we aren't necessarily using them to guide the decision-making that our interviewers and our hiring managers are having to make. The third note here that I really want to point to is that collecting and scoring the detailed information about candidates certainly brings with it an additional cost, but that additional cost is really small relative to the gains that you would get from improving your selection process. So the other article that we want to point to before opening it up to discussion with you all comes from a study out of Vanderbilt University. They ended up interviewing a whole bunch of central office personnel, a whole bunch of principals, surveying hundreds more principals in 2012, 2013. And then what they found is that beyond all of the operational procedures and processes that central office and central hiring teams help their hiring managers, most often their principals, with when it comes to the process, they also need to help those principals in how they approach teacher effectiveness data in their hiring decisions. The decision-making from their principals was really low in data use. A lot of gut decisions were made. A lot of data was collected that then wasn't brought to the table when it came time to say which candidates would be hired and fill the available roles that they had in their schools. Principals need support in identifying the specific data that's going to help them answer the key question of what evidence points to excellent teacher performance from these candidates. What is really the filter? What are the competencies? What are the priorities that I need to see in my candidates? And beyond that, not just principals, but even more broadly, school systems need more specific evidence to help them make an informed decision when hiring first-year teachers, such as their pre-hire indicators that are predictive of later teacher effectiveness. So central office personnel who want to help shape principals and change that hiring decision process can focus on how they recruit and screen candidates, establishing clear expectations for principals that they can bring to this decision-making process, and coming up with systems that help hold principals accountable for the hiring decisions that they make. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it to the group. We would love to hear from you all. Any weigh in on these couple of questions here? First, on a scale of 1 to 10, where's your process? How structured is your process? 10 being a very structured process, 1 being an unstructured process. Second question, when was the last time you even reviewed your process and might have approached making some changes to it? And thirdly, in thinking about redesigning or redefining your process, who would you want to be involved in that? What roles, what perspective is important in making up the team that would redesign or redefine your hiring process? So with that, we'll open it up. Feel free to come off mute or share in the chat if you can't come off mute, but would love to hear from the room and learn from the room where your current practice falls. The wait time is pushing me to narrow down my questions. So we'll start with the first one here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how structured would you say your current hiring practice is? Would you say it's quite structured, maybe a 10, or maybe would you say it's less structured? Catherine saying a 7, Chrissy also saying a 7. And don't have to answer, but would be curious, what components would you say are keeping you from saying all the way to a 10? What elements of a non-structured process might exist that you're thinking of when you share that answer? Excuse my dog that's just sneaking in my room too. Just checking some of the notes here. I need to provide more training to all interviewers so that experience is really consistent. Yeah, for reliability, certainly. And then very site-based. So each school within the district has direction for hiring procedures, but maybe among those different schools, the process may be quite different, Cami. Appreciate that. In shifting to the other part of this question, when was the last time you've come to approach reviewing that process, and what team members would you like to or might you have involved when you redesigned this process most recently? Okay, we'll pause there. We'll go forward. We'll share a little bit more from our point of view as we think about the way that you might approach redesigning this process and which members of your district and school teams might make sense to be involved with it. But perhaps keep that question in the back of your mind. And if something does pop up while we're talking through it, feel free to add it to the conversation and let us know. But I will go ahead and move us forward, passing it back to Daniel as we preview what layout your process might take if you were really to apply that or adapt that structured hiring design to your already existing process.
Thanks, Baltazar. So we'll keep moving here and talk a little bit more specifically around some of the systems and structures that we see are really opportunities for districts to tighten up the way in which they conduct hiring and the ways in which that connect with a more intentional onboarding program. So kind of key question here is how can you develop that aligned, clear, and timely structured process. So 4 components that we think about as we support districts with this work. The first is our candidate profile, and this is actually something that we did really break down in part 1, but getting very clear on the key competencies and weights that we're seeking in our candidates. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more on that perspective, I know Tim had shared out some of those materials, and you can certainly look through some of the ways in which we think about defining those competencies and some protocols for determining weights. The second are the processes and protocols in which your hiring process follows. So this might be the required rounds, the team makeup, or other structures that you have in place across your hiring system. The third is your interview toolkit. So these are going to be typically your interview questions and scorecard. So the specific tools that you provide your hiring teams to conduct those interviews themselves. And then the last part is the candidate roundup process. So the roles, the considerations for decision-making, and actually some sort of development of a new employee profile. So what is the feedback that the school team, the school leader, the district is collecting and providing for the new employee? How these processes are designed will look very different from organization to organization, and we can talk some more specifics. I know there's a question in the chat right now that Balta is helping with around follow-up questions, but want to just really emphasize that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and should be really given serious consideration, given the large-scale implications of these decisions. So regardless of who, how, and what, effective hiring systems design processes that both clarify and share those decision-making powers across those four components: so the profile, the toolkit, the structures, and the roundup. So when we think about organization-wide versus district-wide versus school decision-making, we can think about that along a spectrum. And we recommend really thinking through each of these components individually. So several factors that might drive those decisions might be the size of your district or your organization, your HR capacity. Do you have specific roles, maybe tools, processes, trainings in place? Strategic priorities. So maybe there's commitments that your organization's making around diversity or equity or growing your own talent. So initiatives that are more systemic and need to be addressed at maybe a district-wide level. And then if there's specific retention gaps, so roles, grade bands, subject areas that you're targeting, but if there's really specific areas that you're trying to fill. So thinking about each one of these variables independently, and then determining what level of decision-making is going to be in place. So we just wanted to talk through two sample profiles of districts and organizations that we've supported in this work, and give you an idea of the types of decisions they've made around this. So this is actually a pretty common model of distribution. This is a large district, larger, more than 50 schools. Teaching might look very different from school to school. They span a large region and a large varying set of demographics. They actually have high in-district turnover, so they see teachers going from one school to the next quite a bit. And equity is a strategic priority, and they want to see pieces of their hiring process really making sure that that's included in the systems and structures. So I wanted to just walk through a little bit here. The first, just around district role. Candidate profile. This district provides a district-wide profile that school teams can adjust weights or functional competencies based on the specific role. In terms of processes and protocols, they define set rounds, so 2 set rounds, and there's specific guidelines for team makeup that it be representative of the district demographics. So that's actually has to do with the equity as a strategic priority. The school can determine their hiring team, and if their hiring team doesn't make up the district demographics, they can request district support, additional roles to come in place to make sure that their teams are representative. The third is around the toolkit. So the district provides a toolkit with a bank of questions and rubric, but the school teams select questions and refine those rubric based on individual weights for their schools. And lastly is just the candidate roundup. So the district provides key considerations. Sorry, I'm getting thrown off on my 2 screens here. The district provides facilitator guidelines and processes the offer, while the school leaders conduct the roundup and provide a summary of employee strengths and needs. Another example, this is from an organization that might have more centralized decision making. This is really a common model for charters or orgs with a desire for highly uniform operating models or systems. So this profile is a mid-sized school district, around 15 schools. They have a universal employee development model. They have very consistent student demographics. They have a high emphasis on organizational values. And again, that's going to drive a lot of the decisions you see here on the right. So for candidate profile, they have a very consistent network-wide candidate profile. It is differentiated by grade bands, but schools do not adjust it. They have, in terms of processes and protocols, a consistent 3-round process. The school leader determines greater subjects for class demos, but that's really the only adjustment that gets made along those rounds. The interview guide or the interview toolkit, the network does provide an interview guide with scripted material, but the school leader may adjust or probe based on school specific context. So again, that might be follow-up questions, that might be slight tweaks to the questions themselves based on the school. And then in terms of candidate roundup, the district provides key considerations and processes the offers a rejection, but the school leader does have the decision-making power for the employees at their site. So again, wanted to give a sense of the way we approach this as districts do try to assemble the structured hiring, really getting clear on those 4 variables and then where along that spectrum they fall. Another view you might look at this with, just breaking down the rounds of your interview process. So from application review to reference check or roundup. Thinking about who, what, and what specific components of your candidate profile you're actually assessing. So creating a map like this can really help you get clear as an organization. What are the steps you're taking? Who's involved? What are the specific tools or protocols? And then how are you ensuring that every piece of your candidate profile is getting assessed in a really specific and intentional way? So again, just another way we've thought about organizing this as we support schools and districts with really cleaning up or getting clear on these processes.
So as we think about grabbing our candidate profile and building our interview kit from there, the interview kit does 3 things for us. It first provides that consistent framework so that we can structure the process to be accessible to all of our candidates and aligned to the profile of the role that we're hiring for, whether it be a specific teaching position or a general teaching position. It ensures the quality of questions that are being asked, and that's both in terms of helping you assess candidates, but also collect meaningful decision-making data. And lastly, to that note, it provides that good data. You can determine your response criteria for a reliable evaluation of the folks that you're considering for the role. Some of the components that might fall into that interview kit and that we'll touch on today: interview questions, which is the one that we'll zoom in on, candidate scorecard, criteria for responses as well. All of that can fall within there. If you were with us in our first time, or if you weren't, we took that picture of a candidate profile with all of these slices of different competencies coming together to make up what we were assessing our candidates for. And the interview process, we take each of those slices and come up with the aligned questions that we trust will help us assess to what extent and with certain confidence these candidates can demonstrate and show us that they can demonstrate this competency when they join our team, our school, and are operating within this role. With each of those questions that we pull out, those aligned questions, we also want to come up with the possible evidence that we can use after posing this question to evaluate whether or not the candidate's response indicates to us that, yes, we are on the right track. This candidate does demonstrate this competency and can perform it in the role. When we're thinking about the question creation, there are some big ideas here and small ideas. First being, who is the team that you are going to gather together to come up with these questions, with this question bank that you'll populate your candidate scorecard or candidate interview guide with? Will that be a member of just your district team, or are you going to incorporate different members from different schools, people in the role, people who support the role directly, whether that be the teachers, principals, instructional coaches? But when you do come together as a team to over brainstorm the questions you might pose to candidates, you also want to build your questions within the respective competencies that you're already identifying with your candidate profile. And it is a small note, but important one to remember to phrase our questions always open-ended. Gives us the greatest opportunity to make sure that we're getting information that we can use to evaluate our candidates after. Include related performance tasks with our sample lessons, role plays, data analysis, as long as they are aligned to what the teachers would be experiencing within their positions. And then remember that you're not alone. As many of us are sitting here and have brought ourselves to this conversation time and time again, there are folks hiring teachers all over the US and the world that are pulling from valuable and worthwhile resources out there. So we don't have to reinvent time and time again. One of the resources that I'm going to go ahead and drop into our Zoom chat right now is a question bank that we've taken and built out, organized across some of the most common competencies that we've seen. Daniel, if you don't mind just clicking into that for a quick moment here so that we can preview it. This question bank takes, I believe, 6, maybe it's 7 different competencies that are popularly found within the interview process for teachers, and organizes them with some what we believe to be very strong questions to help guide insights and to measure candidates across these respective domains. At the very top of it, I'll go into that in a second, but there's a filter for questions that we're going to touch on here in a moment. But the bank itself, and I'll mention this again later, feel free to pull from it, feel free to share it with others, but the bank just organizes those possible questions respective to those specific competencies as well. When it comes time to choosing the questions, and this is related to the tool at the very top of the bank that I was just getting at. Yeah, absolutely, Catherine. And again, feel free to share it with others as well within your district or outside of. It's a resource we intend to be able to make accessible to folks. When it comes time to choosing your questions, which is, again, that criteria at the top of the bank there is an important filter for bias that our team has come to run all questions through when we think about posing them to our candidates and to teacher candidates for positions. And that is first relevance, then accessibility, subjectivity, and inclusion. You want to be able to answer yes to all 4 of these questions when candidates, or when you're deciding whether or not this is an appropriate question to put in front of candidates during your interview process. First, is the answer to the question related to job duties? As long as you're designing your questions with your candidate profile in mind, that should automatically be a yes. Secondly, accessibility. Can the question apply to all candidates regardless of their experience? So if a certain question would require previous teaching experience, is there a way you can frame that differently that would make that same question more accessible to any candidate that might be interviewing for that position? Thirdly, subjectivity. Can the quality of the answer be evaluated objectively? Or is it something like, would this person make a good teammate? Is that something that we haven't defined clearly and leaves room for ambiguity in our assessment? And then fourth, their inclusion. Does the question avoid risk for cultural bias? You want to choose the highest impact questions. And to Daniel's example earlier in looking at the different stages of the interview process, consider where you balance them across those interview stages, skewing for more functional competencies earlier on so that way you can really measure for that job readiness. Anchor to questions that give you the best opportunity to assess a blend of situational, behavioral, and skill-based. And then lastly, to take the time to simulate your interviews so that you can make sure that the questions you populated within them fit within the timeframes of your process. You don't want to go through all the process of the time of building your process and then having it not be able to fit within the constraints of your interviews with candidates. It's important to determine your criteria for those responses as well. And that definitely relates to that candidate scorecard, the criteria for responses that we mentioned earlier. Because even though it's a common step folks leave out, it's an essential step to really guarantee reliability in your interviewing process. And then once you have all of these pieces together, we have to take the essential step of training our team before we dive into using these updated tools to assess candidates. Practice aligning a question response, whether that be with a text response, a video example. A lot of the tools that teams found themselves turning to in the midst of the pandemic can be continually leveraged as we think about training. Exactly. As we think about training folks to think of the right measure for different responses that candidates will give us, that really helps up the reliability of our process. The last two notes here we'll touch on are that effective and equitable interview questions are like high quality research. They are valid and reliable in evaluating all candidates in our process. We know that interviewing is a research process, and before we research people to fill a role, it's important to make sure that we have a full understanding of the competencies that are required to find success in that role. Valid questions are going to objectively measure the functions needed, and reliable questions measure for the same evidence time and time again, so that we can truly and fairly evaluate all candidates with our process. After your interviewing is done, there are more opportunities to collect data, and there are some key decisions that will be in front of you. That additional data will help you confirm your potential hires by doing an effective reference check. And that can also set you up to get that last sneak peek of information about how to make sure the teacher that you're hiring is going to get the exact support they need to grow quickly. That's really going to heighten their sense of belonging and increase the likelihood of them growing over time with their school, with your larger organization, your district. And simple posing of questions around that reference check can lead to a lot more insights from whatever mentor or reference the candidate might have provided. It's also important to think about your internal team feedback. In the short term, what was the interviewer process like, so that we can make sure that we're making the right adjustments? In the long term, how are your new hires doing? What's their performance like over time? Do we track that, or is our finish line once they're hired and placed and then we're good? Because the way in which they perform once they're in their positions can also help measure our own reliability in the process that we've designed and built. Also, an important aspect of collecting data, the candidate experience. We all know that there will be bias based on the way that the candidate experience goes. That's an unavoidable layer of bias in that input, but it shouldn't keep us from seeking that input and that feedback from those candidates, so that we can learn from their experience about our process, how we might be able to change or adapt the way we've engaged with them. The decisions in front of us are responsive to that data. First, your new hires, who are you going to make the offer to? And then also in terms of process improvement, what are the small changes? What are the large changes? And what's the timeline for change to the hiring process that you've created? I'll pass it back to Daniel now to open up for hopefully some more fruitful discussion, but I also know it is Thursday afternoon, so the chat is always an option.
Yeah, and Catherine, great question. We don't in this presentation right now, but we do have some examples of that. One, if you come to our part 3, I'll make sure that that is included. So we'd love for you to come back. And 2, we'll see if in the follow-up we can put a sample resource or something in there as well. So we'll see what kind of follow-up we can do in terms of an additional piece. That said, a scorecard does not need to be something very complex. Essentially, what you want to be able to do is lay out your competencies. We recommend no more than 8. And typically have a scale for scoring along that. So a 1 to 5, or there's kind of different scoring systems that people will use, but 1 to 5, and then applying a weight to those competencies. So what percentage value does it have of the whole? So it's actually a pretty simple chart that you're using at again, each one of those steps along the way. So we can certainly provide an example of that, but don't want to overcomplicate it. Again, it's your key competency is a scoring value, and apply it against a weight that typically gets calculated out. So again, we'll see what we can do in terms of providing a visual sample, but also we'll make sure that that's included. Yeah, of course, Catherine. So great question. And also, just if you want, you can even just right now kind of type in scorecard hiring, and there's even just a lot of great examples that'll come up in that as well. So if you're looking for some, you can do that too. We did want to create a space for discussion. I know, as Baltazar said, it's late, it's Thursday afternoon. We also have a kind of variety of different roles here on the line, but would love to hear just reactions to. We shared a lot of content here around really zoomed in on the hiring aspect. Again, we think that this really helps with kind of two pieces. One, it gets you more clear on who and what you're hiring for. And two, it provides you a better ability to provide them with intentional onboarding, which is where we're going to go third in this third part of the series. Both of which lead to longer term retention in your districts. We oftentimes, I think about the current challenges we're faced with as a really small pool, but we also really need to think about how are we sealing up the cracks of the foundation of the pool that we do have. And a big part of that is getting the right candidates through the door and creating onboarding systems that set them up for a positive experience and retention within our organizations. So would love to hear, first question here, what's a small step that you could take walking away from with this content in mind, or a large step, something that you would be more systemic? If you add to the chat, that's great, but if somebody else would love to come off mute, share out, we'd love to hear somebody's voice. And thanks, Kimmy. Creating that question bank for principals, providing better guidelines or more guidelines to use when training their committees on hiring processes. Catherine, thanks. Small step, gathering teams to review those interview questions. And I think the bank that Baltazar shared is a great step. We certainly recommend starting and getting clear on the competencies that you're thinking about as an organization. So those may be the ones that Baltazar shared, but certainly starting there and then moving into the specific types of questions that you're asking along those.
Yeah, related to that, one thing I'll share that some of the partners that we're working with as their districts revamp their hiring process is when they come up with those respective competencies, checking them across two areas in particular that have proven really fruitful. First, your state standards for good teaching, right? There's a reason those exist, and those should be checked as you think about your personal criteria for your district in hiring teachers. But the other area that maybe falls more on the foundational side is districts checking with values that are defined with their strategic plan or their directional clarity as a district to say, oh yeah, our hires fall in line with these values that we're espousing as well. And sometimes that can highlight which competencies belong in their profile.
Thanks, Balto. And Chrissy says, I think a scorecard would be a good action step in my office, or creating that scorecard. Yeah, even just the process of working through to figure out what your scorecard is, I think is a valuable exercise of alignment, and likely will help you spot some of the gaps that might exist within your structures. I'm actually going to share a really quick image here. This is pretty simplistic, but it actually relates very similar to how we structure some of our own interview scorecard. So just getting clear on what are those competencies, what is your scoring scale. This one actually doesn't have weights on it, so we would advise having a weighted system on here as well. So not every factor is going to be calculated at kind of the same place. And then just getting clear on what are the questions or the aspects or parts of your interview process in which those were assessed. So again, this is not certainly an exemplar, but I did want to give a kind of at least a visual reference when we talk about scorecards. We're really just getting clear on what are our competencies, what is their value, and how are we placing those along a candidate. And again, if you align that with some of those that when I zoomed out on the step 1, 2, 3, 4, who, what, and what you're assessing, it gives you a really nice ability to say, okay, we have a really clear way in which we're assessing each one of these competencies.
Yeah, Daniel and Balto, this is kind of related to both at least the first two questions, maybe all the questions on the screen here. That I think one of the biggest challenges for in my opinion for districts or any organization is considering a shift, and especially if it's I think organizationally and with supervisors, it's probably easier to give them more power, but taking it away from them and centralizing, I think that's as an HR professional, right, that's the direction I like to push. But I think that like anything, there's a lot of change management that goes into that shift. So I think everything you've laid out today is very appropriate and justified. It, but the challenge becomes how do you actually implement it and get people to shift, especially if it means taking some of their authority away.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tim. Actually, Balto just left a workshop, and I know he's going right back to it after this. So thank you, Balto, for being here. And he's actually working with a very large district in the state of Virginia to help their teams and their district get more consistent on their hiring practices. And I think, to your point, a big part of that is bringing those teams to the table, getting clear on where they do have a voice and where there is going to be district guardrails. But creating the space for them to make the decisions within the guardrails that have been set. So in that district, the district does determine the set competencies, but does give them the ability to wait those out and the ability to draft the types of questions that they want to ask or want to engage the candidates on. So Tim, I think that's a great point. Again, we certainly don't believe there's a one size fits all in terms of how you do that as an organization. But sharing the decision-making power and bringing everyone to the table and getting clear on what those decisions are that they have a hand in is a really important part of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Daniel. The only thing I'll kind of add to that is that I think the one thing everybody that touches hiring can agree on is that we want the best people and we want the most painless process to get to those best people. And when we think about designing for that, I think being aware and being transparent and really being a great information sharer of, the way we're organized, we have agility here and we need consistency here. That can really help folks understand the way they can plug in, and bringing them to the table and making that shared decision-making process at least informed by different stakeholders in the hiring process that don't feel like, as traditionally we might see, more siloed from one another, and there's kind of like a handoff of information rather than a sharing of it. I think that's a great call out, Daniel, and a great question, Tim, and point to raise for the whole group to think through.
Thanks. The other you talked several times about bias and using these structured processes to remove bias. So I think it's I would make the point that many organizations, hopefully most organizations, are trying to do a better job of diversity and inclusion, and structures, interview structures, and other structures like this is a great way for an organization to see its way to a better place when it comes to those initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. In fact, Daniel, if you don't mind refreshing or getting out of this, I'll point to one last thing here in our closing minutes. I just added this at the very bottom here, that we think about addressing and surfacing bias as a systemic process. I know that we mentioned the question filter as one of the many tools, but the way we think about addressing bias within the system is that first acknowledging that unconscious bias is going to be there no matter what, and it's really a matter of the way that we interrupt bias in that process. And we see it both, or not both, we see it as something that we begin the work with ourselves around, that we as the designers of the process can build checkpoints in to return to that work that individuals and teams are doing. And also we as designers should feel empowered to protocol within our process, right? There's a lot of ways in which you can protocol to protect against that bias. We mentioned one example, that question creation filter. But the bigger conversation, I think, is how do we design beyond mitigating bias and towards diversifying our teacher workforce because of the impact that we all know that can have on our kids. So really appreciate that point and appreciate everyone joining us for this Thursday afternoon. That hour went fast. I'll say, I didn't think it was going to when I asked that first question earlier, but it feels as though we're short on time already.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you everyone. Thank you, Tim, for having us here today. Thank you all for giving us your time. We would love for you to join us on part 3. That's going to be August 26th, same time, same place. If you could, we would love for you to complete our closing survey. It's super short. It just gives us a sense of how the content and facilitation resonated with you today, and that helps us just keep improving. And if you're coming back for part 3, certainly incorporating that feedback. And we'll send out a follow-up, or we'll work with Tim to get a follow-up out to y'all with the slides from today, the resources, and anything else. So thank you so much. Hope to see you again, and have a great rest of your afternoon, and happy almost Friday.